Okay, everyone, so we're going to be talking about ecology. This is going to be our next unit. And remember, we're going to have our open no quiz. This unit's actually going to be a little bit longer, so we're going to have this probably until even after Christmas break. So you'll be really reliant on these notes. Okay, so ecology is study of interactions of organisms, right? Not only between living things, but also the non-living parts of the planet, right? And that interdependence, right, is also really the connections that we have between organisms, whether it be species level or different species, is also going to be looked at when we look at ecology. So the ecological models that we have, and we're going to focus, I'm going to explain them in more detail in the next coming slides, is that we have our individual organism. And then when you combine all of those individual organisms, you have your population. When you have other organisms that are different species, that will be your community. When we look at communities in a certain area that has certain non-living components, like the earth, the water, the soil, those types of things, we call that ecosystem. And then a general area that is defined by that ecosystem would be called a biome. So let's say a forest biome or tundra. So these would be large swaths of area. And then biosphere is all of those particular areas, right, where we find living things. So biosphere is the most all-inclusive. So let me just go back. So we're going to be going this way. So we're going to be talking about biosphere, and then we'll be going less inclusive. So biosphere is going to include all of the areas that include living things. So it's the broadest, most inclusive level, right? And also all organisms are found in this particular area, which we call the biosphere, with the exception of the International Space Station, right? So it's 20 kilometers thick. If the Earth were about an apple, the biosphere would be about as thick as the apple's skin, right? So we have our atmosphere, our hydrosphere, which is water, lithospheres are land, and then everything that is alive in those areas is called the ecosphere, right? And all of this, right, is being encompassed into the biosphere. So the biosphere is composed of smaller units called ecosystems. These ecosystems include not both the non-living component, right, and the living thing. So here you have a cute little bunny. That's our living thing, obviously. But then also that bunny is going to really rely on also non-living components, right? So the air, right, breathing the air, the water, right, even the earth that's going to supply, the soil that's going to supply grass for it to consume, okay? So the level of organizations, we just talked about biosphere, quickly ecosystem, right? And then we're going to be talking about communities, populations, and the actual organism itself, right? So the community is all of the living components, right? So here you can see these are just the living things found in the ecosystem. Population are going to be species specific. So all the species found in a given area would be a population. So for example, if I said, what are the population of gray squirrels on Long Island? Right, that's the definitive answer for population, species, and you have to give an area, right? The simplest level would be the organism itself. So the habitat is going to include a place where the organisms are going to live. So like a desert habitat, a forest habitat. So this is defined by not just the living things that are there, but also the non-living components. So that would be your abiotic factors. Everyone always thinks it's just like, the living system that we talk about, but the ecology actually takes into effect what the non-living thing is and how reliant it is. Ecology is actually a new topic. It really wasn't understood until probably the 70s when we realized that there was an interdependence. That's because we started destroying the planet and we saw a collapse of ecosystems because we were removing species and over harvesting and over farming, that we actually saw a collapse in ecosystems. And then we realized that, wait a second, you change one thing, but it has an effect on another. So ecology is really a new piece for us culturally, but something that was well understood by many other other cultures like Native Americans understood that interdependence. So it's really important that we look at both not the living things, but also the non-living things. We kind of take that for granted, right? But it's the temperature, right? Certain organisms can't live in an area without a certain temperature, or pH, right, which is acid or base, and that's going to be in your water environment. Salinity, right? How much salt is in the water, right? Salty environment can support only certain types of fish. Minerals, right? That's going to support certain plants. If there's minerals that are missing, the plants won't survive, and then the animals won't survive based on that. So there's really an interdependence. It's not one thing over another. They really are a balance. right? And of course, our gases are extremely important as well. So a response to environmental changes, each organism has a very limited range that can survive, and some more than others. We call that a tolerance, and we represent that in a tolerance curve. Some organisms can actually acclimate or adjust their tolerance to certain abiotic factors, and then some don't. So for example, goldfish raised at different temperatures will have different tolerances for temperatures. So that's why when you acclimate fish, you have to put them in the, get them from the pet store, you put them in the bag, or they're in the bag, and then you bring them home, you have to leave them in the bag for 10, 15 minutes so they can acclimate to the temperature. So that's just a quick example of how organisms need time in order to change their biological piece to match the environment. If you put them right in the water right away, you don't acclimate them, they can actually die instantaneously. So quick example, there's many other ones, but... So when we look at those internal controls, that's going to also tell us how well they can acclimate or not. So conformers are organisms that do not regulate their internal conditions, right? So they're going to be cold-blooded, which is what we call them. It's like reptiles, snakes, and things like that. Fish, although some fish are, like tuna, actually are regulators, but for the most part, most fish are not. They're conformers. Regulators are going to be like us. They're going to be organisms that use energy to control some of our internal components. So the warmer you are, the more energy that you're going to require, right? And then also the more energy that you could provide at any instantaneous moment. That's why lizards and fish are going to be slow moving when it's very cold out. Some species can even survive unfavorable conditions by entering a state of dormancy. So actually, when we looked at the yeast, some people are asking, well, how old are the yeast? I'm like, they could be up to a year, 2 years without even breathing, right? So they enter a state of dormancy, which we know bears do as well. But the bacteria and the yeast and things are actually kind of strange. They've actually found things that are thousands of years old and then are in a state of dormancy, and then they can sprout and survive. So it's kind of interesting. And then, of course, some animals have modification where they can migrate to different areas, right, to survive those different temperatures. So the niche is the way or role of life. So a lot of people get niche, and we'll have, worksheets on this, but a lot of people get habitat and niche confused. So like if you said your habitat, like what's your habitat? You'd say, oh, Long Island, my house, my school. It's like where you live, right? Patchogue or Medford, right? That's your habitat, suburban, right? But if you talk about your niche, it's the role that you have. So now you're not going to say, if I said, well, what's the role that you have, or what job do you have? You're not going to say, my house, or, well, maybe it is, or suburbia, right? That doesn't make sense. So the niche is the role. So like, let's say, you say, I'm a student. If I say, what's your niche? I'm a student. I have a part-time job. I play sports. Like those are the things that you do, right, in your community. So that's what a niche is. So when we look at organisms, we also say that they have niches, right? They have a job, right? And that job, sometimes if we take it away from the environment, it causes the environment to collapse. So that's why niches are really important to understand. Like, what is their role? What's their job? What are they doing for the environment? So there could be generalists, organisms that can tolerate a wide range. So like if we look at this bird right here, if we look at, one bird, it might be able to occupy any area, right? It's a generalist. But this is an example of a specialist where this bird is going to only live on the top part of the tree. So you say birds are in trees, but actually they might only go in certain areas depending on what they feed on. So these all are going to feed on the same tree, and you'd think there might be competition there, but that's not the case because they're all feeding on different things. So we call those specialists, right? But again, what they're doing is their niche. That's their role. So when we look at energy transfer, we know we're talking about ATP. Right? So ATP is going to be reliant on, number one, the sun, right? So that's our abiotic factor right there, really reliant on that. And autotrophs, we call them producers because they're going to be producing their own energy, right? In the form of sugar, which then gets converted to cell respiration, okay? There are some examples that actually we've learned, again, in the 70s when we were able to get to hydrothermal vents in the bottom of the ocean. There's actually some autotrophs that don't use sunlight. So this is maybe how the Earth got started. They use an energy source called chemicals, sulfates, and we call that chemosynthesis. So there's no sunlight at all at the bottom of the ocean, and they actually use chemicals to make their own energy, which is kind of interesting. And we call those chemotrophs. And those are the ones we're looking for on other planets when we're searching for life, because that's kind of how life started here on our own planet, the bottom of the ocean. All right, so productivity of an ecosystem. This is a gross primary productivity. So that is called the GPP, gross primary productivity. We're going to have a poll on this, so it's a little challenging. It's a little bit math. But what we're looking at is the rate at which producers in an ecosystem capture the actual sun, right? And then they make their organic compounds. How much energy do we have that's trapped there? Some plants are better than others at that. Then we're going to be looking at the actual biomass, right? And how that biomass can be transferred on through the food chain, right? And food web. And then what could we support with that ecosystem? A lot of people don't realize ecology is very heavy into math. So we'll be looking at some of those numbers when we get into class. So here is a little bit of an easier breakdown because here you see the formula. So you have your NPP. Your NPP is your net primary productivity. This is the energy per unit area per year. So that's actually how many calories that we find. So here you have your sun being captured by a dandelion. And that dandelion is going to supply energy to drive cellular process and to be available as a food source for another organism, right? So organisms that are going to rely on eating, so herbivores that are going to rely on eating plants, are going to also have a certain amount of biomass that's being transferred into that energy component and then into our carnivores. So what we actually see is that when you develop a food chain, it's short, okay? And why is it short? Meaning you only have an herbivore, let's say, a carnivore, maybe another carnivore after that. You don't have anything continuous because the biomass and energy gets lost as we go through those components. So in order to get the net primary productivity, we have to take away the gross primary productivity minus respiration, okay? So if we look at this calculation, you could look at your net primary productivity. You can actually see that it changes throughout the year, which is kind of cool. And here you can see it down there, 2000. Well, this is different years, but also seasonal, right? You can see that. So there's a quote that says, "All flesh is grass." So meaning that all of our energy came from the sun. Which was transferred to the herbivores, which is transferred to us, whether we usually eat the herbivore itself, right? Unless we're eating plant products. So 300 trout, just to give you an idea, here they're starting to figure out ecology in the 70s, that 300 trout are needed to support one man for a year. The trout in turn must consume 90,000 frogs that must consume 27 million grasshoppers that live off of 1,000 tons of grass. So it shows you how much could you support in an ecosystem, right? And we care about the animals, but we also care about us, right? How much can we support? Sorry about the bell. Okay. So looking at that, we have our different roles, right? And we have different names for them in the environment. So let's look at that. We have our consumers, which we know are not going to be producing energy. They're going to be consuming their energy, right, in the form of grass or in the form of proteins. So if they're going to consume it in grass or plants, we call them herbivores. So they're eating producers, right? They're eating plants. Carnivores are going to be eating other organisms. Omnivores are going to be eating both. Detritivores might be a new word for you. Detritivores are consumers that feed on garbage. So like a worm would be a detritivore. A lot of people think they're decomposers. That's not the case. Decomposers are organisms that actually break down dead material into minerals or nutrients. Detritivores are just literally eating garbage, right? So it's a little bit of difference. So when organisms eat each other, the energy is transferred. Energy in an ecosystem always is starting out with the producer. And this is what I was talking to you about before, that you get this run out of energy. And that's because you're not going to have as many calories as much biomass on each level because that organism is going to utilize that energy. So food chain is a single pathway. Feeding pathway, and we also call it a chain. So here, you've probably seen this before, right? So we always start out with our producers, then we have our herbivores, then we have our carnivores, and then sometimes we have a food chain with a secondary carnivore. Here's a secondary carnivore and then a tertiary carnivore, but then it runs out. you really don't go anything after a secondary carnivore. You sometimes get tertiary, but very rarely because the energy level runs out, right? Remember the guy, what he said? It takes 27 trout to survive for a man to survive on, but that in turn would be reliant on, let's say, 1,000, tons of grass, right? So you run out of energy as you go through the food chain. Why do you run out of energy? It's because you're going to use it just for life functions. You're not going to actually preserve it in your biomass. You're going to be using it, burning it off. So food chains are good, but really realistically, what we look at in ecology is our food webs because they're more indicative of the environment, right? And you can see all the interrelationships between them. And remember, those food webs are created from food chains, right? So you would add them all together and create that. We'll be doing that in class as well. So here's an energy transfer rule, 10%. So we'll be looking at the real numbers, but these are just guidelines. On average, only about 10% is going to go to the next trophic level. Why? Some organisms are going to use that energy just to survive, right, itself. So for this reason, most ecosystems only have a few trophic levels. So in an ecosystem, usually the organisms that are on the lowest trophic level are the most abundant, right? There's the most biomass. And as we go through the higher ones, less energy is there to support it. So that's why you only have a few carnivores in comparison to producers. Okay, we're going to go ahead and stop here at species interactions, and then we'll continue this the following week, okay?